Hello, everybody. David here. Welcome. Here we share true stories from real people. Today, starting out with the first story. My father refused to walk me down the aisle because his golden daughter had a housewarming party that day, but he called me desperately when I found a replacement. For a long time, I always knew my parents loved my older sister, Vicky, more than me. She was the planned child, while I was the result of an accidental pregnancy just 10 months later. They probably didn't even want me, but they decided to keep the pregnancy anyway. My mother's parents had passed away before I was born, but my father's parents were very much alive, so they took on a significant role in my upbringing. Grandma and Grandpa were the constants in my life, providing the love and support I often felt was lacking from my own parents. I remember so many occasions when my parents would leave me behind with my grandparents and only take my sister on trips. When I was young, I didn't mind because it was fun living with my grandparents, but as I grew older, around 6 or 7 years old, I realized how unfair it all was. But my problem wasn't just with my parents. It was also with my sister Vicky. Although I didn't hold a grudge against Vicky, I couldn't help but feel like an unwanted addition to the family. She always competed with me for everything, whether it was grades, our parents' attention, or even the smallest achievements. It felt like a constant battle for validation, and I was always on the losing side because my parents preferred her. Always. As a result, I felt really inferior, and we never really understood each other. Our relationship seemed more like a perpetual competition, with her always coming out victorious. On one occasion, she wanted to be friends with a group of girls, but since she was a nerd, she was afraid to approach them. One of the girls and I had art classes together, so she introduced me to the rest of the group and we all used to hang out together. Vicky was so jealous of this that she made my parents talk to me about including her. Moreover, whenever she was with them, she tried to pick fights. But my mom called me selfish while my dad said she was my sister and that I should look out for her. Reluctantly, I agreed and introduced Vicky to the rest of the girls. Now, Vicky didn't have many friends, so she might have seemed overly enthusiastic. She constantly tried to impress the girls in our group, often coming across as annoying. Despite her efforts, she struggled to find her place among them, and the awkward tension between Vicky and the other girls was always palpable. For instance, one of the a boy, so Vicky took it upon herself to approach the boy and let him know the girl liked him. He laughed because he wasn't interested and went around telling everyone, which embarrassed the girl. After this, the girls clearly told me they didn't want Vicky to come to our meetups anymore, so I agreed. However, Vicky didn't take it well. She threw a tantrum when she found out the girls didn't want anything to do with her and insisted to our parents that I shouldn't spend time with these bad girls either since I was her sister and should stand up for her. I refused and told her it was her fault the girls didn't want to be friends with her, but my parents, as always, took her side. They gave me a lecture about how Vicky didn't have bad intentions, that I should try to convince the girls to forgive Vicky, but if they didn't, then I should stay away from them too. I refused and stood my ground. I liked hanging out with them, and unlike Vicky, I wasn't going to my friendship in any way. I told my parents that I'd had enough, and it wasn't my responsibility to find friends for Vicky. My parents got mad and gave me the cold shoulder for weeks, but I'm glad I stood firm. This group of girls has remained my friends to this day, and they are basically like my sisters. I have cried with them, laughed with them, and shared some of the most significant moments of my life. That wasn't the only reason Vicky came to hate me. There was also another incident involving a boy she had a crush on. A boy I had no idea about, and with whom I sat in some classes because we were friends. He tried to ask me to the prom, but I politely declined because I was already going with someone I liked. Later, when Vicky found out, she made a big fuss about it, telling our parents how I always took the things she wanted, and that I was flirting with the boy knowing how she had felt about him for months. She called me a bunch of nasty names that no one should say to their own sister, and told my parents how she wished I wasn't her sister. My mother took her side, telling me that what I did was wrong and that, as a sister, I should respect the girl code. I tried to tell them that I wasn't even interested in the boy, and that I had declined his invitation, so she was free to ask him if she wanted, but Vicky refused to let it go. Looking back, I think she knew the boy would have rejected her anyway, so she just wanted to take it out on me, because he had invited me instead of her. Once, my dad took me out for ice cream, telling me he wanted to have some father-daughter time with me. This had never happened before, so I was really happy. However, he started asking me a bunch of questions, like if my boyfriend and I were being careful, if my boyfriend came from a good family, or if my boyfriend and I were doing drugs. I was stunned by his line of questioning and asked him what he meant by all that. That's when my dad revealed that Vicky had been making up stories, telling my parents for months that I was doing drugs and drinking alcohol with my boyfriend. This was a complete lie, and I showed my dad my phone to prove that Vicky was lying. Later, when my dad confronted her about all the lies, she tried to justify it by saying that no one our age just spends time with a boy, and that I was hiding things from everyone. I was so angry that I yelled at her for trying to create unnecessary problems and told her it wasn't my fault she didn't have anyone to go out with, but that she needed to stop meddling in my life. Vicky didn't accept it and hit me. This happened out of nowhere, as she had never been physically violent before. My nose started bleeding as I fell to the floor, holding my face in pain. My parents rushed me to the hospital, pleading with me the whole time not to press charges against Vicky. They kept saying how it would ruin her life, while I sat in the back seat, clutching my face. Vicky didn't even care, nor did she apologize. Later, when the nurse asked me about the incident, I told her the truth, and she called Child Protective Services. My parents were furious with me for involving Child Protective Services, seeing it as a betrayal of family loyalty. In their eyes, Vicky's actions were dismissed as a mere accident and an isolated incident that didn't warrant such drastic intervention. They pleaded with the authorities, insisting that Vicky was not a danger to me and that her actions were out of character. In the end, Vicky was released, but they warned my parents that they would be closely monitoring our situation in case of any further incidents. As you can imagine, Vicky was really upset, as were my parents. Later, my parents told me they were disappointed in me for trying to ruin my sister's life. My mother started crying and said I was tearing the family apart by involving outsiders. My father's disappointment was palpable. His words were always full of reproach as he questioned my decision to escalate the situation. I firmly told them I wanted Vicky out of my life, and they agreed. I felt guilty for involving the authorities, but for the first time, I felt safe in my own home. Once Vicky had been formally warned, my parents had a separate conversation with her, and from that day on, she stopped talking to me completely. I much preferred this to having her constantly hovering around or trying to insert herself into my life. When my grandparents found out about this incident, they asked me to pack my things so I could live with them for the rest of high school. They informed my parents, who didn't protest much, so I went to live with my grandparents. Unlike my parents' home, I felt safe and loved here. The remaining days of high school went well, and I made lasting memories with my friends. My parents never visited or called me during that time. I knew they were happy with their beloved daughter, so I never tried to contact them, although it hurt that they could discard me so easily as if I were nothing. When I graduated from high school, my parents made the day all about Vicky. They didn't even congratulate me or approach me, and I felt like a stranger to them. However, my grandparents were there and scolded my parents for being so obvious about their favoritism. I don't know what my grandfather told them, but my dad then awkwardly approached me and congratulated me. Later, I found out that I was accepted into a good university with a full scholarship. I was very happy about this because I was afraid to ask my parents for financial help. I informed my grandparents about this, and they invited me out to dinner at a nice restaurant. After dinner, my grandmother posted photos of me on her Facebook account, writing a long caption about how proud she was of me for being an outstanding student. Our relatives soon found out and joined in the congratulations. I guess some of them might have contacted my parents, who had no idea about all this. Instead of feeling happy about it, My mother called me the next day to tell me that Vicky had locked herself in her room, crying because she hadn't been accepted into any university, and that I was consciously trying to make my sister feel bad about her grades by talking to all our relatives. She said it was all my fault because apparently Vicky was depressed after the incident with Child Protective Services, which had pushed her to get bad grades. I was so incredibly devastated that my own mother could blame me for something like this that it was the last time I spoke to her. My grandparents helped me move into my university dorm. Since my high school boyfriend's university was far away, we broke up, so I entered college single. The breakup had been hard, but I was excited to meet new people. This is where I met Rob, and he and I were both freshmen, spending half of our days in the library. Rob was different from anyone I had met before. He was a quiet person who liked to study, similar to me, and we quickly found common ground in our shared love for university life. As weeks turned into months, our friendship blossomed into something deeper, and I realized I had developed feelings for Rob that went beyond mere friendship. Being an extrovert, I was quite direct about my feelings for Rob, and I was surprised to learn that he felt the same way. We started dating and have been together for 8 years. My grandparents have met Rob and absolutely adore him. I've met Rob's parents, who literally treat me like their own daughter. On occasions, Rob's mother has even confided in me that she always wished for a daughter, so she's happy that Rob met someone wonderful like me. Honestly, this is the first time I've been surrounded by family who appreciate me and don't hold any resentment. I've told Rob stories about my childhood, and he listens and knows about my relationship with Vicky. Over these past 8 years, my parents have barely contacted me, except for the occasional birthday message if they remembered, but that's about it. Recently, Rob and I got engaged. He proposed to me while we were hiking to our usual spot to watch the sunrise, and it was a dream proposal. It was so sweet to see how nervous he was when asking me the question, and I had no doubt in my mind when I accepted his proposal. I posted engagement photos on my Instagram and also informed my grandparents about it. They were so happy for me and congratulated us on our future. I guess the news must have spread because my parents called me out of the blue to congratulate me as well. I thought it was just a casual conversation as we hadn't spoken in years. They asked about my life, my job, my apartment, before my dad directly asked if he could walk me down the aisle. I was surprised by his sudden question since moments before, he didn't even know what company I worked for. I told him I hadn't thought about it yet, and my dad said it would be embarrassing if he wasn't invited and that others would question it, so it would be better if he walked me down the aisle. I told my parents that I wasn't even sure if I was going to invite them to my wedding since we hadn't been in contact, which upset my parents. My mother started telling me how disappointed she was with my response, emphasizing the importance of family and tradition. She continued saying how they would always be my parents no matter what, and that I should leave the past behind. Part of me was tempted to listen to my parents and accept my dad's offer because I wanted our relationship to be repaired, but another part of me doubted, fearing opening myself up again to potential disappointments and hurts. However, I was about to start a new chapter in my life in a few months, so I told my dad that he could walk me down the aisle, and he seemed delighted. During the wedding preparations, I contacted my high school friends, with whom I had always kept in touch, despite the physical distance that had grown between us due to our careers. I told them how I wanted the group to reunite, and that I wanted them to be my bridesmaids. There were many tears of happiness and congratulations, and without hesitation, they accepted my invitation to be part of my bridal party, as it was an opportunity for all of us to get together again. We all planned to go to Las Vegas to celebrate my bachelorette party, while Rob had a separate bachelor party with his friends as well. My friends and I posted a bunch of photos from the party, and in general, everyone had a great time. However, when I returned home, my parents called to inform me how disappointed they were that I hadn't invited Vicky to be part of the celebration. I told them there was no way I would have involved Vicky in my bachelorette party, and that I didn't want her to be part of my life. This surprised my parents, and they asked me what I meant, so I clarified that Vicky's actions, particularly her history of lies and gossip, had left me deeply hurt and distrustful of her intentions. I couldn't imagine inviting her to such an intimate and joyful occasion as my bachelorette party, knowing that her presence would make my party less happy. I also informed my parents that this was why she wasn't invited to my wedding either. Upon hearing this, my parents lost their temper. They complained that I had no right to exclude my sister from my wedding, and that it was my duty as her sister to include her in such important events. They told me that Vicky was excited to see me after hearing that I was getting married. I was confused and asked my parents what gave her that idea, since we hadn't even spoken in a long time. But my parents ignored my concerns, saying that this was not how sisters behaved. I told them that they had to understand that my relationship with Vicky is complicated after everything that has happened. I simply don't feel comfortable having her as part of my wedding. She hasn't even once apologized to me for everything she put me through. However, my parents generally ignored my words. My mother kept saying how she wanted everything to be resolved, and that I should make an effort to invite Vicky. My father insisted that our relatives would talk about why my sister wasn't invited, and this would end up affecting my wedding. However, I knew it was better not to give in to their demands, so I stood my ground. I told them that it was fine for people to talk behind my back and question my character, as long as I was surrounded by people I liked and trusted during my wedding. My mother then asked if my fiancé would be okay with this, and also tried to use the in-laws card, saying they would judge me for being so incredibly cruel as to exclude my own sister from my wedding. I laughed and informed my parents that my fiancé and in-laws were aware of my family dynamics, and none of them would care if Vicky was present or not. They pressured me to reconsider, suggesting the importance of family unity and forgiveness. But I didn't budge an inch, as I wasn't willing to compromise my own well-being for the sake of appeasing others. In the end, we agreed to disagree, each of us holding on to our own perspectives, and my parents told me they needed to think things over. We ended our conversation there. I informed my grandparents about this because I felt a bit guilty about standing up to my parents, and they fully supported me. My grandparents told me I shouldn't force myself to invite anyone I didn't want there, and that my parents, as usual, were trying to make me feel guilty. Since that conversation, I felt a bit better about my decision, and have been distracting myself with wedding preparations. As my wedding date is quickly approaching, last week my dad called me to inform me that he had thought a lot about it, and he and Mom would no longer be attending the wedding. Before I could react, he continued saying that this also meant he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. I asked if there was a specific reason, and he informed me that Vicky would be moving to a new place soon, which my parents had helped her find, and since I was going to exclude her from the wedding, she had decided to hold her housewarming party on the same day, so they would be attending that instead of my wedding. I couldn't believe what my father was telling me. He wasn't invited in the first place, much less was he going to walk me down the aisle, yet he felt the need to tell me that he was the one deciding not to do it. However, the idea that my own sister's housewarming party took priority over my wedding was a hard blow, a continuation of what I had felt for years. I simply told him that I understood and hung up the call. Although I tried to act brave in front of my father, deep down, the pain of rejection affected me. When I told Rob, he was furious at how insensitive my parents could be after they were the ones who insisted on being invited. He was the one who gave me the idea that I should ask my grandfather, as he and Grandma had been more present in my life than my parents. I agreed, so I called my grandparents and asked if they would be willing to walk me down the aisle at my wedding. I couldn't hold back my emotions while asking my grandfather. "You and Grandma have always been there for me," I said, my voice breaking with emotion. "You've been more than just grandparents to me. You've been like parents, and I can't imagine anyone else I'd want by my side on my wedding day." My grandfather didn't hesitate before saying yes. He told me how honored he would be to walk me down the aisle, and unlike my parents, he wouldn't let me down. His words reassured me, and at that moment, I felt a profound sense of peace. With my grandparents by my side, I knew I had a family that loved me unconditionally and accepted me just as I am, with all my imperfections. I also spoke with my father-in-law about this, and Rob's parents assured me that they didn't care if my parents attended or not, and that regardless of their presence, they were delighted to witness and support our union. My wedding is in 2 days, and today I woke up to several missed calls from my dad. I called him back thinking it was an emergency, and when he answered, he asked if it was true that my grandfather would be walking me down the aisle. I told him yes, it was true, and then my dad got furious, saying how disrespectful it was to ask my grandfather. I reminded him that he was the one who decided not to come to my wedding, so I didn't understand why he was so upset. My dad continued yelling at me about how he and Mom were just trying to make me see the error of my ways, and that they thought by declining the invitation they would teach me a lesson. He went on to say how he and Mom had raised me and paid for my food and education, so my grandfather had no right to replace him. I tried to reason with him, explaining that my grandfather had been there for me in ways he and Mom never were, but he wouldn't listen. He also told me how I had done nothing but push everyone away, and that all this was my fault. I don't think I've done anything wrong in this situation. I guess anyone else would have done the same, but as the subreddit requires me to ask the question, am I the bad one for asking my grandfather to walk me down the aisle and not my father? Update 1. Many have given their opinions, and most have said I'm not in the wrong. I've seen a lot of advice and suggestions on how I should approach this situation. I agree that I need to permanently cut contact with my parents because their constant indecision is exhausting and is starting to affect my mental health. I don't want them in my life when they've consistently shown me that Vicky is always their first priority. My parents are selfish, and I've known this for a long time. However, how can a daughter simply stop loving her parents? It's much easier said than done, but it's very hard to actually do it. However, for my peace of mind, I have no other choice but to do it, so that I can enjoy my wedding tomorrow. Update 2. I apologize for the lack of updates this past month, but I've been quite busy since my wedding. Firstly, yes, my wedding went quite well with my grandfather by my side as I walked down the aisle. Despite my parents' absence, I couldn't have been happier exchanging vows with Rob, committing to spend the rest of our lives together. My friends and I danced all night, and I can't begin to describe how important it is to stay in touch with your childhood friends, no matter what, because sometimes they are your chosen family. During the reception, I felt a slight pang realizing my parents weren't there to share this special moment, especially when I saw Rob's parents and cousins giving speeches for him. However, I found comfort in knowing I had made the right decision for myself, prioritizing my own well-being and happiness. Some of my friends gave speeches, sharing memories of our experiences and the bond that had carried us through both good and bad times. In the days following the wedding, Rob and I went on our honeymoon, which his parents had paid for as a wedding gift. I spent all my days just lazing around, enjoying time with my husband. I feel so thrilled every time I look at Rob and realize he's now married to me. As I mentioned earlier, I cut all contact with my parents by blocking them everywhere. I didn't bother sending them an explanation because frankly they don't even deserve it. I have no idea if Vicky really had housewarming party that day, or if it was just an excuse for my parents not to attend my wedding, but at this point, I don't care. I wish them and their beloved daughter nothing but the best. Update 3. I didn't intend to share more after my last update, but something unexpected just happened, and I think you all deserve to know. I hadn't checked my email in the last month because of my wedding and honeymoon, but today, while going through emails, I found an email from Vicky. I don't even know how she found my email address, and it completely surprised me. I hesitated whether to open her email or just delete it unread, but as the saying goes, curiosity killed the cat. Inside was a long message from Vicky expressing her regret over our strained relationship and her desire to reconcile. She acknowledged the mistakes she had made in the past, admitting that she had been selfish and immature. Vicky apologized for the pain she had caused me over the years and expressed a genuine desire to make amends. She went on to write how she feels happy for me now that I am married and wishes me nothing but the best. She ended the email pleading with me not to punish our parents by cutting them off and said that they missed me. Reading her words, I felt a mixture of emotions, surprise, skepticism. Part of me wants to believe that Vicky has really changed, that she is sincere in her apology and willing to work to repair our relationship, but another part of me remains doubtful because this seems too good to be true. However, regardless of what she wrote, I know for certain that my parents do not miss me, because if they did, they would not have treated me this way all these years. I thought about replying to her, but then decided against it. After all, forgiveness is not something to be rushed. It is a process that requires time and reflection. Still, I am unsure if I want to have a relationship with her again. I might forgive her, but that does not mean we are going to finally be sisters now. To be honest, after my marriage, I no longer feel lonely. I've learned to recognize that I have my loving husband by my side, supportive friends, and the unwavering love of my grandparents. And with their support, I know I can face any challenge that comes my way without needing Vicky or my parents in my life. I've also looked into and found a good therapist with whom I have booked my first appointment. I have taken this step to be able to address and resolve any wounds from my past and heal from them. Update 4. I believe I did the right thing by not responding to the email I mentioned in the last update, because now everything has come to light. It turns out that Vicky did not write anything, it was my parents using her account. That's why the email emphasized forgiving my parents so much, because they were the ones who had written it. I know this because I happened to run into Vicky one day, and when I greeted her, she looked at me with disgust as usual. I mentioned the email to her, thinking my lack of response was the problem, and she told me she hadn't sent anything. She pulled out her phone and found the email in the sent folder, but she swore she hadn't written it. At that moment, we both realized who the author was, since surely some computer at home still had Vicky's session open. I also asked her about the housewarming party, and she told me that it never happened, so as I suspected, it was all a lie from my parents. We then went our separate ways, and that was it. Honestly, I don't know who is worse in my life, my sister or my parents, because at this point what my parents did is just too twisted. At least now everyone will know, because I made a post on my Instagram with links to my Reddit, so the whole family and close friends are reading this story.